An original podcast from podlatino.com.
In 1980, the world stepped into a new era without any fanfare. There was no single signal, no precise turning point. It was more like the accumulation of several movements happening simultaneously in different corners of the planet, that in hindsight formed something resembling a starting line. That year brought together a set of Olympic Games turned into a political arena, a freshly ignited war in the Middle East, a labor movement beginning to challenge the Soviet order from within, the assassination of one of the most influential musicians of the century, and the birth of a video game that would permanently change the relationship between people and screens. All of that happened in 12 months. It is a good place to start understanding the 80s. The backdrop of the year was the Cold War, that permanent state of tension between two superpowers that since 1945 had organized global politics like an enormous chessboard. The United States and the Soviet Union never faced each other directly, but their decisions shaped everything. The governments they backed, the wars they funded, the alliances they built. And in December of 1979, the Soviet Union had done something that pushed that tension to a new level. It invaded Afghanistan. Officially, it was an intervention to prop up a struggling Allied government. In practice, it was an expansion of Soviet control into a strategically critical zone, at the doorstep of Central Asia and close to the Persian Gulf. Washington read it exactly that way, and the response would come in the early months of 1980. President Jimmy Carter announced that the United States would not participate in the Moscow Olympics. It was an unprecedented decision, boycotting the Games as a form of diplomatic protest. The logic was straightforward. If the Soviet Union was going to host the biggest sporting event in the world, the countries that rejected its policy in Afghanistan were not going to hand it that platform. Several Western allies joined the boycott, though not all of them. West Germany, Japan, China, and more than 50 nations signed on. Others, like the United Kingdom and Australia, left the decision to their own delegations, and some athletes competed anyway under neutral flags or the Olympic symbol. The Moscow Games went ahead in July and August, with reduced participation but full competition. For the Soviet Union, it was a chance to project organization and capability. For many athletes around the world who were kept away, it was a painful loss. They had trained for years toward a moment that politics took from them. The Games happened, but they carried that invisible weight throughout. That image of an Olympics shaped by geopolitics would become one of the defining marks of the period. Thousands of miles from Moscow, in the Middle East, 1980 opened another front that would leave a deep scar on the decade. In September, Iraq invaded Iran. What followed was a war that would last 8 years and leave the region wounded for generations. To understand why, it helps to remember what had just happened in Iran. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution had overthrown the Shah and established an Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. It was a radical transformation, a country stepping out of the Western sphere of influence and taking on a political and religious identity unlike anything else in the region. Saddam Hussein, who ruled Iraq, saw in that moment of upheaval an opportunity. Iran was weakened, its military reorganizing, and there were long-standing territorial disputes between the two countries, particularly over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a strategic river border. Hussein calculated the war would be quick and decisive. It was neither. Iran resisted with a combination of revolutionary fervor and enormous human resources. The conflict bogged down quickly into a grinding, trench-based logic that echoed some of the worst episodes of the previous century. The Iran-Iraq War would become one of the bloodiest conflicts of the second half of the 20th century. with casualty estimates exceeding 1 million people. But in 1980, all of that was still ahead. What the year made clear was that the Middle East was entering a new phase of instability, with two regional powers locked in combat and an international community watching closely because that region held much of the oil that kept the global economy running. Meanwhile, at the heart of the Soviet bloc, something was beginning to shift in a way no one could have predicted a few years earlier. In Poland, a country under Moscow's orbit since the end of World War II, workers at the Gdansk shipyards launched a strike in August of 1980. From that strike came Solidarity, the first independent trade union in the Soviet bloc. Its leader was an electrician named Lech Walesa, who became the face of a movement that went far beyond wages or working conditions. It was a demand for rights, for freedom of association, for space for civil society in a system that allowed none of it. The Polish government, under pressure, recognized the union. It was a concession without precedent. Moscow watched with growing unease. Solidarity would grow in the years that followed into one of the forces that would eventually hollow out the Soviet system from within. But that process began at the Gdansk shipyards in the summer of 1980. The year was not exhausted by wars and tensions. In arcades, bars, and shopping centers around the world, a new machine appeared that no one could quite ignore. Pac-Man arrived in Japanese game halls in May of 1980 and crossed the ocean shortly after to become a global phenomenon. The concept was simple: a yellow circle eating dots through a maze while avoiding colored ghosts. But its impact was enormous. Pac-Man was not just a game. It was a signal that video games could capture all kinds of people, not only young technology enthusiasts. Women, adults, children, everyone got hooked. The electronic entertainment industry, which had started with the digital ping-pong of Pong in the 70s, was on the verge of becoming one of the largest businesses on the planet. Popular culture that year had a particular texture. Film, television, and music were occupying more and more space in everyday life. In movie theaters, The Empire Strikes Back was drawing massive crowds, confirming that the Star Wars saga was a cultural phenomenon built to last. Television was beginning to evolve with new formats and longer broadcast hours, and music was everywhere, spanning everything from punk to reggae, from soul to progressive rock. It was the year the world was listening to AC/DC, who released Back in Black, one of the best-selling albums in history, recorded after the death of vocalist Bon Scott, with Brian Johnson stepping in to take his place. It was also the year Bob Marley's illness became public knowledge, a shadow that already loomed large over global culture, even before his death the following year. And then, in December, came the news that stopped the world for a few days. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his apartment building in New York. He was 40 years old. He had been one of the members of the Beatles, the band that in the 60s had redefined what popular music could be, and in the 70s had built a solo career marked by songs that blended the personal with the political. Imagine, the song calling for a world without borders or wars was perhaps the most widely heard anthem of his generation. His death made no sense, as no murder ever does, and the reaction around the world was one of genuine, widespread grief. Thousands gathered in silence in Central Park. The impact ran so deep in part because Lennon was a figure who seemed to embody something people wanted to believe was possible: that culture could actually change things. That same month, Ronald Reagan won the presidential election in the United States by a wide margin. It was a significant and telling result. Reagan arrived with a clear message: less government, more market, and a hard line against the Soviet Union. His rise represented a conservative turn in American politics that would have enormous consequences not just inside the country, but across the global order. The relationship between the two superpowers throughout the 80s would be shaped in large part by the way Reagan understood the world. And that understanding was of a battle that had to be won, not simply managed. 1980 ended with a particular feeling in the air. It was not just the opening of a new decade on the calendar. It was a year that had shown, across every one of its fronts, the tensions that would define the next 10 years. The Cold War was alive and hardening. The Middle East was on fire. A labor movement in Poland had started pulling on a thread no one yet knew how far it would unravel. Popular culture was accelerating and becoming more global. Domestic technology was beginning to take up more room in everyday life, and Western politics had shifted toward conservatism in a way that would rewrite the rules of economics and diplomacy. All of it was present in those 12 months. The decade did not wait to show what it was made of.